Hi everyone, welcome to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. We're going to continue thinking about grain line in relation to our quilting. If you tuned in last week, we talked about lengthwise grain and crosswise grain, and we talked a little bit about bias and how that can affect your construction, your quilting construction. So we're going to really focus on that today. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on that in relation to this shape, which is a square made with two half square triangles. And if you haven't ever made this shape, what you want to strive to do is to create a shape so that the outside edges are on the straight of the grain and the bias is along the diagonal edge. That's your most stable, your strongest unit. And there are two trains of thought when it comes to creating these things. One is to oversize and then trim them down, or to piece them with precision so that there's no trimming down necessary at the end. And you can pick and choose which way you want. But once you start to look at these things, you're going to realize that they kind of fall into two categories. One where you cut first, then you position, stitch, and press. And another one where you position, stitch, then cut and press. And I'm going to talk to you about which one what are the issues associated with the two. Now, the oldest way of creating these things was to cut half square triangles, and you cut them with a straight of grain on the two sides, and the bias was on the middle. And there have been a lot of things created over the course of the years to deal with that type of cutting. Templates, if you follow Marty Michelle, she has a line of templates that will precision cut those shapes. If you have the easy angle, that's another tool that does that. The Omnigrid 96, my Scrapmaster ruler, these will all precision cut the triangles so that when you position, stitch, and press them, you're going to end up with supposedly perfect shapes. And you know, if you have AccuCut, it will do that too. Precision cuts, but it will create units that have the straight of grain on the edges. The only issue here is when you're stitching on an unsecured bias, and that can sometimes get things out of shape. So use some extra care when you're doing that stitching along the diagonal or along the bias. All right, after this method, probably the next most popular method is where the bias is contained. It's still intact when you sew, and it's where you cut two squares, position them right sides together, and stitch on two diagonals, either two diagonals that are marked or the center diagonal, and stitch from that center marking line. But you position it, stitch it, then cut it apart, and then press it. So there's only one area, the pressing, that can actually cause distortion in your blocks. Personally, I always like to make those squares oversized at the beginning so that I can trim them down to a high precision unit when I'm done, resulting in shapes that are on the straight of the grain on both of those edges. Now, again, lots of methods that are out there, and over the years there have been some shortcut methods, and I'm going to talk to you about a couple of them that you'll see and what are the issues associated with them. First one is paper. Some of you are familiar with paper foundation piecing. There are papers out there that you can use for making half square triangles. The Spinning Star design has papers that you can use with squares. The triangles on a roll have rolls of paper patterns that you can put on there. I like this one because it tends to be the most efficient, but both of them have the same working scenario. They have lines for you to stitch, they have lines for you to cut, and when you're done, you're going to end up with fistfuls of all the same pieced half square triangles. There are a couple things when I do the paper. First of all, shorten your stitch length. Second of all, when you press, which is the only area that can get distorted, keep the paper in when you do the pressing. And when you remove the paper, which you're going to have to do, make sure that you're not removing the paper starting at the ends of the line of stitching, which can release your stitching. Remove your paper by simply tearing into the middle, pulling out this way, and pulling out this way. You'll have less distortion in that block when you're done, but you are going to have half square triangle units that are on the straight of the grain on all the edges. So paper's pretty good. If I needed to make 500 of these, I'd probably go back to the triangles or on a roll quickly. But the other thing is, remember, you buy a roll and it only does one size. If you want different sizes, you're gonna have to buy different rolls. All right, multiples. Over the course of the years, we've developed ways to make more than just 2 half square triangles at one. We have a method out there that we have put on one of our technique sheets that we use along with our Tucker trimmer that's called 8 at once. And you're going to see this out and about. And essentially what it will do is we have, you figure out the size you want to make, it will give you the size squares to cut so that when you stitch on 2 diagonals, here and here, and then cut north and south and cut east to west, you're going to end up with 8 half square triangle units. If you use my numbers from the technique sheet, you're going to see that they're going to be oversized, so I get to trim them down. I actually like that. But all of the edges of every single unit is on the straight of the grain. That makes it strong and stable when I use those shapes in a project. Now, there's a multiple cutting method or construction method out there right now that concerns me just a little bit. And let me explain. It's a method where you take 2 squares, and these happen to be 5-inch squares, so they could be from a charm pack, layer them right sides together, stitch on all the outside edges, and then cut from corner to corner. That will indeed make 4 of these half square triangles. And the issue is that when you construct this way, all of those outside edges of those half square triangles are on the bias. So when I take one of those units and I give it a stretch, oh my goodness, look at that. It's a problem that is a potential issue further on down when you're doing your construction. So know that if you're going to do this, you're going to have lots of bias in lots of your shapes, and be aware of that fact. There are other shortcuts out there. Some of you might know, some of you might not know, but they deal with strip piecing. And there's an older one that I actually kind of liked. It's where you would cut bias strips, and after you cut your bias strips and piece them together, you would then cut in one direction, and then you can come back and cut your square. So you get one square there, you get one square there, you get one square there. But all your squares, because you started with bias strips, are on the straight of the grain. So I actually like that technique pretty much. But there's a strip piecing method out there right now that, again, has me a little concerned, because they'll have you sew straight grain strips on both edges. And then once the sewing is done, cut your triangles out of those shapes to create your half square triangle units. But again, you have pieces that have 4 bias edges. It's getting so out of shape. I can't stretch here. That's the area that I should be able to stretch. And there's another shortcut method out there that has you cutting multiple lengths of straight grain strips, putting them together, cutting diagonally once you're finished there to create those half square triangles. But what you again have are the units with bias on all the edges. And you're seeing me stretch this just little here. Look what happens if I put a row of them together and I give a stretch. Oh my goodness, there's no way I can keep that intact and keep that under control when I'm constructing a quilt. Unlike something like this that's done on the straight of the grain, no stretching involved. So knowing is going to help your sewing. And keep these thoughts in mind. If you're unsure about a tool or a process, test drive it. Give it a try before you cut your entire project out and realize, oh my goodness, I've got something with all those biases on there, and I'm not gonna not be happy. Now, next week, I'm gonna actually change pace a little bit, and I'm gonna share with you a project. And it's a project that I Tuckerized, and it's a project that has to do with these half square triangles. And so join me next week. I'm going to call it Hocus Pocus, because it's amazing what you're going to see when you the options that you have. But rest assured, you know that it's all going to be on the straight of the grain, so it's going to be good and stable when you're done. All right, I'll see you guys all next Thursday. Take care. Have a good week.